All right, let's talk about something reasonably controversial. My opinion is that domestic violence shelters for women should not exist. I'm going to spend this video explaining why that is. I can understand that some people might bristle at that when they first hear it. So let me just start off by saying, and I really shouldn't have to do this, but obviously I have tremendous compassion and support for women who've been through domestic violence. I'm grateful that they're getting help and support. I'm not going to mention the women in my personal life who have helped through these kinds of issues and my own exposure to domestic violence because frankly, it seems a little bit in poor taste and kind of demeaning that I should have to tell my own personal stories in order to establish some credibility. So hopefully you'll just take me at my word. This video is not coming from a place of a lack of compassion. If anything, from my perspective, it's coming from a place of increased compassion. But from my perspective, domestic violence shelters for women are a bad idea. We should get rid of them. Obviously, we want resources available for people who have been through domestic violence. We want a place for them to go where they can feel safe, where they can get back on their feet, where they can feel protected. But for me, the question is not, the obvious one, should such a place exist? It's what is the best way to achieve that feeling of safety? How can we best help these people, not just in the short run, but in the long term as well? I'm going to be making the case in this video that segregating women in their own domestic violence shelters away from men actually does more harm than good. So what is the basic theory behind a woman's only domestic violence shelter? Okay, she's been with an abusive husband, an abusive boyfriend, one night, he's been hitting her when he comes home drunk, as he, usually does, and she flees, she takes off. Maybe she's got some small children that she takes with her, or she's by herself, and she goes to one of these domestic violence shelters, and she feels comfortable and safe because he doesn't know where she's gone. There's resources available. There's other women who've been through the same thing. And she's like, okay, this is a safe environment. It's away from him. It's away from men. Finally, I can actually rest easy. If she stays for a long time, then she might join the rehabilitation programs or the therapy support groups, whatever they have available, where she hears stories from other people. She recognizes her own story and what they've been through. Like, oh yes, he used to do the same thing to me, and he used to make me feel crazy. And, I used to be ashamed to show people my bruises, my wounds, whatever it might be. And that shared experience, that sisterhood, makes her feel stronger, more confident. She's got people around her who understand what she's been through and are there to support her. Now, I'm not going to deny that there is a certain utility to separating people into their familiar groups, to be around people who've been through a very similar situation to you. They have a shared background. You have a lot of characteristics in common. That can be a healing experience to feel like, this is my tribe. These are my people. We understand each other. I'm not denying that that can have a healing effect. But you know what else can be extremely healing is being around people from completely different groups, from completely different backgrounds, sharing your pain and suffering and listening to their pain and suffering, and realizing that despite there are numerous differences on the surface between you and them, that there are actually really important connections. There are very important similarities. It's a bonding experience to see somebody who it would seem that they had had a completely different life experience to you, different race, different social class, different gender, and yet there is a strong similarity in what you've both been through. There's an ability to bond over something deeper than all that surface level, group distinctions. There's something at the shared humanity that actually forms that bond. This has been my experience. I have been the victim of sexism against men. I have been abused by women, but I've also spent a lot of time speaking with women about their experiences, the sexism that they have experienced, the abuse that they have experienced from men onto women. And you know what? I am always struck by the similarities. Yes, it does present a little bit differently, female onto male abuse, male onto female abuse, but in the hundreds of conversations that I've had with women, listening to their stories, empathizing with their suffering, I have been again and again struck by how similar their stories are. The theme is the same, it's just presenting a little bit differently. And to me, that has increased my feeling of safety. It's made me feel more connected to my fellow human beings. It's made me feel safer out in the world because there's a sense of being less alone, less scared of the other. I focus on that bond, that which makes us all the same. Knowing that it can be such a healing experience to be with people of different backgrounds, of different groups, but to bond over your shared humanity, it begs the question, why, when it comes to domestic violence, do we segregate based on genders? Why do we resort to our base instincts for tribalism? And our first, impulse is to separate based on groups. There's this free pass that we seem to give. It's free from scrutiny when it comes to gender. Like, of course, we're going to separate female domestic violence, victims away from men. That just makes sense. But just stop and think for a moment. I know that that's how we've been raised and that seems as normal in this culture, but why? Like, just apply that same principle to a different group. Let's say I had been abused by a homosexual person, and then I went to a domestic violence shelter for straight people. And once I got there, I was like, there's no gay people here, right? And the coordinator said, no, you're safe now. Everybody here is straight. Let me assure you, there's no gay people here at all. You hear that story and you think, okay, well, that's outrageous. That's incredibly homophobic. Or what if it was done based on social class and I'd been abused by a poor person and I went to a domestic violence shelter for rich people? Or what if it was on the basis of race? I'd been the victim of violence from a black person and I went to an all-white domestic violence shelter and the person was like, you can sleep easy here. There are no black people. Okay, when you hear that, it prickles, right? Like, you're like, oh my God, like, what are we doing? That's not okay. The reason why you're having that reaction to that is because you're very rationally recognizing that a person's race, their social class, their sexual orientation isn't the relevant factor when it comes to somebody perpetuating violence. And so to resort to tribalism and to segregate based on your group identity when it comes to being a victim of violence, that doesn't make any sense. It would be racist, it would be class-phobic, it would be homophobic. And yet, for some reason, this is totally normal when it comes to gender. Of course, not every domestic violence shelter in the West is segregated by gender. There are some shelters that accept men and women, and I applaud that because, as we know, men can absolutely be victims of domestic violence. Where I live in my country, Australia, they ran a survey in 2012 where they asked 17,000 Australians questions about domestic violence. And what they found is, of domestic violence victims, people who had experienced domestic violence from their partner, 1 in 3 of those Australians were men. If that surprises you, it's probably because you've been listening to statistics about domestic violence reports made to the police. But unfortunately, there's a bit of an epidemic of underreporting of male victimhood in domestic violence. Now, that's possibly because men are worried that the police aren't going to believe them. They might feel ashamed about being a victim to a woman. Maybe the violence wasn't that bad. There's a couple of slaps, a couple of hits, and the man thinks, well, I'm not going to go to the police. Like, I can handle this. So men are victims of domestic violence. That is an indisputable fact. But it does seem to me that the conversation about this very quickly becomes tribalistic and focused on gender. Like, if you go onto a men's rights forum, right now, like, you pause this video, you go into Google, you'll probably see a whole bunch of statistics talking about how often men are abused violently or emotionally abused by women, or the amount of false, police reports that are filed by women. But of course, the same is going to be if you go onto a feminist forum. They're going to talk about how, men are much more likely to commit fatal acts of violence, or how much it's an epidemic, or our cultural attitudes. And everybody seems focused on trying to determine, well, which gender is more culpable when it comes to this domestic violence epidemic. Are men the real victims, or are women the real victims? And for me, sitting on the sidelines, it makes me want to tear my hair out. It's so incredibly frustrating because I don't understand the point of it. If we do manage to establish by an agreed upon set of facts that women are the victims 51% of the time, well, then what does that mean? Like, why is that relevant? Do we just ignore the 49% of men? Or even if it's 95% of the time women are the victims, so what? Like, does that mean that we have no sympathy for the 5% of men? Like, why are we focused on the gendered aspect of this? It seems like in our obsession to find somebody to blame, we've missed the obvious culprit and settled for a very, very surface level scapegoat, like men are the problem, or men, or women are the problem, or women. Well, guess what? The real perpetrators of violence are violent individuals. I wish in our recovery programs and in our shelters here in the West, we focused on that being the message. Who abuses people? Abusers. Not men, not women, abusers. Because here is my concern. If a woman goes to one of these domestic violence shelters and she's fleeing from an individual, her boyfriend who's been violent, and she goes there and she is shut off from all men and she's told this is a safe space because there are no men here, how is that going to be good for her in the long run when she has to re-enter society that's filled with men that she might want to date in the future? How is her sheltering herself from that exposure to half of the population possibly going to be good for her long-term healing? If anything, it just reinforces the idea that the actions of that one individual should be collectively blamed on all of men. How does that make sense? What do we really want for domestic violence victims? Do we want them to be integrated, healthy, safe-feeling individuals that are capable of making connections with all their human beings and leading a normal life again? Or do we want to turn them into political pawns? Why would we want that? That seems so callous to the individual suffering that they've been through. Doesn't it seem like it would be so much better for domestic violence victims of all races, sexual orientations, social classes, and genders to be in a place together where they can share their stories and bond over the single experience that actually unites all of them, the fact that they are victims of domestic violence? Don't focus on the tribalism. Don't focus on the group identity. Bond as individuals. I don't mean to be insensitive. I can understand how in the very first instance, if a woman has been the victim of violence from a man, if she goes to a domestic violence shelter and she sees other men, possibly men who look like her boyfriend, she might be a bit worried to begin with, a bit terrified, like a bit sort of triggered. But the thing is that trigger itself is irrational because those men haven't done anything to her. And so why would we reinforce and give credence to that trigger, to that irrational thought? What we want to do actually, in my opinion, is encourage her to look past that. Like, oh yes, I can understand seeing men might be a bit triggering. We all have tribalistic instincts. We all make those snap judgments. Not denying that, not shaming that, but we don't need to encourage it either. If anything, it would probably be good for you to reach out to some of those men who've been through what you've been through. You're going to find that a very healing experience. See, I actually don't believe that this is some kind of conspiracy against men. I don't ascribe that sort of malice to the way that things have been, about. I think that this is probably just a mistake that's gone too far. Like way back when we established some domestic violence shelters for women on the very, very easy to come to a conclusion like, oh, they'll probably feel safer if there are no men there. And then it just sort of snowballed from there. But we didn't actually stop to really think through the implications for that decision. But just because that's the way that things have been done in the past doesn't mean that we need to continue that way in the future. I think that we have a genuine opportunity right now to cast off all of this collective guilt, all of this toxic tribalism, and finally focus on ourselves as individuals and bond with other people as individuals. Again, my 100% sincere sympathy for women who are victims of domestic violence. I truly hope that you get the help that you need and that you recover. It's just that my belief is that your recovery will be better facilitated by exposure to men, not separating yourself from them. If you want to test the quality of a woman, should you open up to her emotionally to see how she responds? The answer is kind of, yes, but you have to do it in a very specific way. This is the topic of my latest Patreon video. It's quite in-depth and it goes through a sort of guide for how to judge the quality of a woman based on her emotional capacity and how she responds to you. So if this is something you've been struggling with, how much emotions to show your partner, what's reasonable to expect from them, I highly recommend you go and check out that video. It's available on my Patreon. My Patreon's just $5 a month. It's a wonderful value. You instantly get access to every single one of my exclusive videos. I post there twice a week. We have a great community, great discussions. It's a great way to support the creator. I'd love to see you over there so you can be a part of it.